Hey there everyone, welcome back to part 2 of what we think would be the perfect Souls game. Now, a lot of you have been asking for it, so we thought we'd just finally get it out there. So yes, we are continuing the series. Now, I just want to say before we go on, this is going to be a very opinionated piece, quite discussive, and maybe a little long-winded, hopefully not. Though, if you disagree, tell us in the comments, tell us your ideas, and we might add them to a later video if it's something, we like and it goes in line with our vision of the game. Now, a lot of you do seem to agree with our ideas, which is great, but if you don't, that's totally fine as well. Just don't be a dick about it, please. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in this video, but firstly I want to quickly go over our angle for this video. All our ideas are coming from a game design basis. Ideally we're trying to formulate ideas and concepts that would impact gameplay in a meaningful way, and try to promote build variety and creativity, or to expand upon already established ideas such as weapon arts, which we'll cover in this video. We want to avoid ideas that a lot of people would have that, only amount to like cool shit, something retarded like, imagine you could ride Sith while you fight Gwyn. Nothing like that. We want our ideas to be an actual game mechanic, so that's what we're going to be focusing on. So our first topic is weapon arts. Now, when it comes to weapon arts, we think that both power stancing a la Dark Souls 2 and weapon arts could both be in the game at the same time. There's no reason why they can't coexist. Or, at the very least, Dark Souls 3 should have given your offhand weapon rolling and running attacks. Miyazaki. Arsehole. It makes sense gameplay wise as well. You give up your weapon arts to be able to wield two weapons. Plus, weapon arts weren't really all that much. They mostly just amounts to just a flashy attack, which is cool, but it doesn't justify the dual preset weapons that we were given, instead of being able to, power stance any two weapons that we wanted to, like in Dark Souls 2. And two-handing could just be as simple as press triangle to power stance if you can power stance, hold triangle and press R1 to two-hand the right weapon, or hold triangle and press L1 for the left weapon. Really, the only improvement over Dark Souls 2 is to just have some element of the UI to give confirmation if you are able to power stance any two weapons or not. That's the only way I could see to improve the system. The system was perfect, made sense. Now, our idea for weapon arts is an idea that we feel should have been the way weapon arts were used in Dark Souls 3 from the start. The way it was described somewhat hinted at this as well, however, we think that weapon arts should work like gem slots or something like that. Basically, every weapon has two slots and you can pick and choose what arts to equip to your weapon. So basically, it lets you customise your weapon's moveset. You'd get given a bunch of basic ones by default, and certain arts could be only used on specific weapon classes, etc. You could find them around the world or get them from vendor NPCs, and they're basically just spells for weapons. Some unique weapons could have a fixed art that you can't unequip, but you could pick the other one. Given the fact that we would do away with the mana bar, which we'll get to, having arts tied to the durability like the special attacks in previous games, or even just cooldowns, there just wouldn't be an issue. It's quite hard to spam arts in their current form, and many of them can be used without mana or with just like 1 point of it anyway, so being tied to the mana bar was just kinda arbitrary. Some arts could be tied to Int and Faith, potentially, to cater for spell sword builds as well, and a good selection would obviously be required to add an extra element to your character builds. The possibilities are endless though really, especially when you factor in weapon arts that act like buffs, or weapon arts could turn your weapon into a casting tool, and remember, weapon arts for your fucking casting tools to begin with, so just fucking weapon arts for everyone. So as today's video is about magic, it begs the question, what magic system should be used in our game? And honestly, although we have an answer for this, we would completely understand if you disagreed. Our preferred method would be to use fixed cast amounts like in Dark Souls 1 and 2. Now, please don't get us wrong, we really do love the mana bar, it does feel nice, but it does have disadvantages that we think outweigh the advantages. The last section of this video will be a discussion for both systems and why we pick stacks over mana, but for now we'll just go into the things that we would want for a game that are completely set in stone. But for the sake of this video, all our choices are based around the stack system and not the mana bar. So, hexes. We would like to see hexes become their own class of magic again. Alongside this, each school of magic could be focused around one particular playstyle type thing with their own unique edge. Of course, each school needs its generic weapon buff, basic projectile, but there could also be more advanced specific buffs for each school, for example, Darkmoon Blade being the best buff unique to Faith, or a unique hex buff that causes extra stamina damage, or a pyromancy buff that never turns off but with less of an effect. The potential list is endless really. You could even have like 3 different buffs for each school, who knows? In regards to catalysts, we think that it should be staffs for magic, pyroflames for pyromancy, talismans for faith, and chimes for hexes. A gripe of ours was splitting hexes into talismans and chimes only in Dark Souls 2, it's fucking irritating. However, this leads us on to our most interesting point of the video, multi-school casting tools and casting animations. An idea we think would insert a lot of tacticality into the game would be to have a selection of casting tools that can cast more than one school. Some of these have already been in the game before, but we would like this to be expanded upon, such as a staff that can cast pyromancy, indeed a casting tool for each school that will also cast hexes, the obligatory talisman that scales off in, etc. The reason we want multi-school casting tools to be a thing is because 1, it opens up a variety for players, but our other idea would be that the main school of that casting tool that it's from could cast both schools with the same casting animation. Okay, so here's how. This could lead to a lot of cool spell mixing, for instance, a pyromancy flame that can also cast magic, hence, it can cast Crystal Soul Spear like a Great Fire Orb. Now, just for talking's sake, assume that hexes use the spellcast animation from Dark Souls 2, the one where you kinda like throw it out. So, hence, you could get a staff that casts hexes with the Dark Souls 1 and 3 animations, the one where you hold it above your head, or even a talisman that launches Forbidden Sun like a Great Lightning Spear. There should also be a nice selection of spellcasting weapons like the Blue Flame. You could even have weapon arts that let you cast spells from a weapon like we said, but maybe, you know, it could take up both slots just to balance it. Imagine a Cestus that could also lob fireballs, that'd be pretty cool. So imagine the possibilities of being able to choose a school you like, choose the casting animations and hence a secondary school of magic you have access to, and then being able to choose the weapon arts for your specific tool. The build variety would just be astronomical off this system alone, and that's not going into all the different things you could do in the game. You can further expand upon casting animations. Now, I think that spell charging should be a thing. It's quite surprising Dark Souls 3 didn't have some aspect of this implemented, honestly, because they did take charging from Bloodborne. Now, there are a few ways of going about this. It could just be as simple as holding down R1 to power up the spell. The longer you hold, the more extra damage it will do. It allows you to stagger your spell casts as well. Nice and simple. The other way of doing this would be able to charge and store a cast spell like Mega Man's Gun or Samus. This would be fantastic for magic builds, as you could save a cast for the right time that you need it. Now, I would say this isn't broken at all. It's exactly what magic needs to be competitive, as magic in its current form is kind of garbage, and we did say that we wouldn't want the game to be as slow as Dark Souls 2, so magic would need some kind of extra edge. And of course, this is a nice addition to PvE as well. We think it would be balanced by the fact that you'd be able to tell what spell is being charged and stored via the initial casting animation and whatever sounds it makes. And of course, the release of the spell would be maybe like a stock animation just for the released spell, and that would be faster than the default animation, but not so much faster as to make it completely unavoidable. You can take this even further by applying a unique charging animation to each school of magic's casting tools. For instance, the pyromancy charges could throw the casts further and faster, so imagine combining that with the glove that could cast lightning spears or magic. Talismans could increase the area of effect for miracles on their charging effect. This would make a lot of sense for co-op, allowing you to charge a heal miracle with a huge radius. So although that wouldn't affect everything, it could affect how large an area of effect from like a poison fog could be, or you know, the distance that Firestorm covers. So, you know, there's so many different combinations that you could do with this. And just imagine just like fucking launching a Crystal Soul Spear like 500 miles an hour. That would be fucking intense. Next, we have a little quality of life improvement. An idea that I've wanted in Souls games since like Dark Souls 1 basically, would be able to assign spells to a casting tool, essentially giving the R2 or L2 of a casting tool more purpose. Now, I think Dark Souls 2 like almost did this. In the beta, you could fire out a heavy version of a spell with the R2, but they dropped that. The easiest way I could think of doing this would be to hold up on the spell that you want to assign and then press R2 or L2 to assign the spell to that tool, if it's able to cast it. Instead of tapping up, which the release of up would cycle through the list of spells like it normally does. So essentially, if you had 2 casting tools equipped, you could assign 3 spells at one time that you could actually use. One for L2, one for R2, and the spell that's currently active that you'd cast with your R1 or L1. Builds that use multiple schools of magic would benefit greatly from this. For instance, if you only had one spell from one school, you could assign that spell to the specific tool and you wouldn't need to worry about scrolling through all your spells to get to that specific one. This system just makes comboing spells significantly easier overall, really. Now of course your weapon arts could be incorporated into this system as it currently stands. The L2 of your left hand casting tool is the weapon art, so you could still have this unless you assign a spell to it. The same could go for your right hand weapon as well, so if you don't care about the weapon art of that tool, you can just assign a spell to it instead, and two hand in your right hand would then allow the L2 for its weapon art. as well as having R2 for the assigned spell. Finally, you could instead assign spells to the tool via the attunement menu. This is less robust in terms of like not being able to switch spells on the fly, but overall it's like the easier method. We've mentioned this before in our videos, but we firmly believe that spells shouldn't have a requirement, like in Demon Souls. Instead, you can attune spells at any level. There are two ways to go about this. Have low level spells have a decent base damage but very low scaling, and have high level spells have a lower base damage but insane scaling. Ideally, high level spells would always do more damage than a low level one, but not by much at lower levels. You could alternatively work backwards, with each spell having like a recommended level instead of a required one, and the spell's power is reduced the lower you are under the recommended level, possibly to like just a certain point. We think it makes sense that as you level up more, the gap between the weak and powerful spells widens due to the more powerful spells having better scaling. This gives the player the choice of using a wider array of spells at a lower level. Things like buffs and debuffs can also be affected by this system, giving a lower effect or a shorter duration. Now, our reason for this of course is to yet again open up as much variety as possible for players, but when we look at Dark Souls 1, this system is basically just how pyromancy worked, so just apply that system to our hypothetical game. Now, this system goes hand in hand with how we think scaling should work in conjunction with the casting tools. Basically how Dark Souls 1 works, in Dark Souls 1 each catalyst had a magic adjust stat, and that was what increased off your int stat. You had your usual selection of tools that gave different takes on such things as like high scaling, low base adjust, or low scaling, high base, etc. Spell damage was nice and simple, it was calculated at just X times magic adjust, and Crystal Soul Spear being 3.2. We like this system a lot as it bases how powerful your spells are on how powerful your equipment is, which is how we think it should be. And the higher your int, the better tools you can use, and hence the more magic adjust you get, and hence the more damage you put out. Now, the reason Pyromancy was balanced was because the magic adjust from the Pyro Flame had to be upgraded, but it received no scaling from stats, so the obvious way to balance this is to reach a middle ground with everything, right? Bear in mind that in Dark Souls 1, you couldn't upgrade staffs, but you did upgrade the Pyro Flame, so you just apply the Pyro Flame's logic to the staffs. Now, if this wouldn't work, please scrutinise in the comments, but if you had to reinforce staffs to upgrade their magic adjust and scaling, but they also receive scaling, just not quite as much, as well as the spells receive scaling to offset the lower scaling values of the staffs, this should amount to a nice middle ground allowing you to attune powerful spells at a low level, while still having them do a balanced amount of damage. I don't see why I need to wait until level 40 to do 500 damage with a spell when I'd be fine with it doing half that at level 20. Plus, even if it isn't optimal, it's down to the player to decide how they want to play. So basically it's like a combination of Dark Souls 1 Pyromancy, Demon Souls method of being able to equip anything you want, upgrading staffs like in Dark Souls 3, and at the same time you should probably be able to infuse staffs like in Dark Souls 2. Finally, we should talk about attunement. We think that in order to make it feel like you're getting more out of attunement, instead of having to put 30 into the stat to get 5 slots like in Dark Souls 3, the game should give you way more slots, at least double the amount anyway. To counterbalance this, the cost for spells can be increased, this way you don't feel like you're forced to upgrade your attunement in bulk just to get one poxy slot out of it. Of course in Dark Souls 3 attunement increases your mana bar, so we don't have the mana bar, so this is like a way of like kinda making attunement feel more worthwhile without having the mana bar. Now, something that should be addressed actually is casting speed. Frankly, it just sucks dick. How about all spells are balanced in a respectable way? Instead of having spells be ever so slightly slower at lower levels, just make the spells good to begin with. None of this dex improves cast speed bullshit. Just let the spells be inherently usable and not fucking unusable if you don't have a certain stat and fucking something else. Now this has actually been, like, as much as a small problem, it's been a problem in Dark Souls 1, 2 and 3. In Dark Souls 1 you needed 40 dex in order to get the maximum cast speed, and you know, you're just at an inherent disadvantage if you didn't have that. Now the problem that we have with it is it's just very limiting. It forces you to use the cast speed ring, it forces you to basically invest in dex or attunement or whatever it was in fucking Dark Souls 2 in order to come up to that base amount. You know, casting speed is so unbelievably important because without it, you're just basically useless. Like, you can't fucking hit anyone with it because your attacks are incredibly telegraphed and they don't come out fast enough. So instead, just make all the spells completely good and just make it balanced in that way, as opposed to forcing players to have to invest a ring slot and a fucking ring just to in Dark Souls 3 just to get something that's like less terrible, not even good. Alright, so now we got all that out of the way, we can finally break it down and talk about the pros and cons of each, magic system, and what could be done and, improve upon it. So now, just quickly, I want to go down on the record and say that I think the game should be like Dark Souls 1, where you get a fixed amount of Estus at a bonfire and can trade an important item to get more of it. This was a perfect system and allowed areas to be perfectly balanced, but we will get into this in more depth in a later episode. But for the sake of this argument, we are assuming that the Ashen Estus system from Dark Souls 3 is the way of regaining mana for a mana-based system. So we're going to start with the mana bar. So the advantages of the mana bar is that it does feel a bit more like an RPG. It falls in line with what you expect of RPGs, and that is a good thing. Seeing your bars grow over time does give the feeling that your character is improving and that you're getting stronger. The mana bar can also stop spell spamming to a degree, as you're forced to regain your mana via whatever method of regen the game has, which we're assuming is Ashen Estus for the now. This is good in PvE and PvP, and it means that you need to stay wise with your mana and manage it well. Chances are strong spells can only be used a few times before you need to recharge. So as I said, it does stop spam, but it allows the player to control the amount of uses they have overall of specific spells. You could fire out many low level spells, or fire out a mix of low and high, or just focus on high level. This is good as well. Now sadly that's about all of the specific pros of the mana bar that I can really come up with. At this stage it starts to fall apart in terms of PvE a little bit. The mana bar becomes difficult to balance. The designers can't account for players having the max amount of Estus shards available at that point. They can't account for the player going full Ashen Estus and just spamming spells and running away, making the game trivial. And before anyone says anything about lightning spears in Dark Souls 2, that's kind of a different balancing issue, and due to stacks it was much easier to balance, although they did overbalance it and then make it fucking useless. Anyway, in theory, choosing between damage and healing capability sounds correct, but technically casters are playing with a handicap anyway, because non-magic builds don't need Ashen Estus and are given the full complement of healing Estus. Both builds played correctly shouldn't involve one of them inherently having less healing. Understand the point of magic is for ranged combat, so you trade off your healing for free damage. I still think that the trade-off itself should be in the stat investment. A mage generally are inherently squishier, because to get usable magic damage you need to invest stats away from equip weight and HP. So that's the trade-off surely? I feel like this was an issue in Dark Souls 3. Depending on the player, it could make the game too easy by them abusing Ashen Estus, or too hard because, the spells are kind of weak, blah 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 blah. And understand that surely you could just tweak it until it is balanced for PvE, but there's kind of more to it than that. It's quite a hard thing to describe why it's hard to balance, which is quite irritating for me. But looking at magic in both Demon Souls and Dark Souls 3, you can kinda see how it raised more issues than it solved. And I was really looking forward to the mana bar coming back, but after playing with it I realised I actually did prefer the older systems, and there was a reason why they changed it. Now, I suppose as this is just a hypothetical game, and as it's our fantasy game, we could just say, well, we would have the game use the mana bar, but it would just be balanced. But that's a bit lazy, isn't it? And frankly, it would be nice if FromSoft ever gave these videos a watch, you know what I'm saying? Now, the mana bar is super hard to balance in PvP, because yes, technically, right, it does stop spell spamming, sort of. It actually amounts to more spell spam, but with some breaks. No longer are you limited to just 2 to 3 Forbidden Sun a match. You can fire off about 40 if you want, you just need to swig an Estus. We like the tacticality that limited uses gave. It's sort of like a duel. You don't want to blow your load too early and then have nothing to back it up, and then you're staring down the barrel of a gun. That was a fucking terrible metaphor, but you can kind of see what I'm going with that, And it's so weird, right? Because on one hand, it makes magic really underpowered because you get so many casts of it. So clearly in Dark Souls 3, there are just the power of spells quite a lot. But you can fire off so many more of them. But then in Dark Souls 3, like the spells don't have enough tracking, so you can't even really hit anyone with them anyway. Which is why they've clearly, you fire off so many of them. It's really fucked, right? The magic is really fucked in Dark Souls 3. So I want to go over some suggested improvements for this system, I suppose. One is to have a sort of spell stamina bar as well, and when that fills up you can't cast or something like that. It would have to fill up and unfill slower than normal stamina. Now this is a little clunky in my opinion. You already have enough things to keep track of, and you know, technically the stamina, it costs stamina to cast spells, and that still hasn't really offset spell spamming in any way, when clearly I suppose it was meant to. So frankly, I don't even think that, I mean, it's just a horrible system. I can't remember who the fuck suggested that, but whenever I thought about it, I'm just like, nah. The next one you could combine with cooldowns for powerful, or all spells really, but obviously this would affect powerful spells a lot more, which honestly isn't a terrible idea, but you know, that would really only apply to PvP and boss battles, and frankly, sometimes you do need to be able to throw out 2 powerful spells in a row just, you know, to be able to hit or get it to work. So actually kind of gimps magic really hard at the same time, and frankly, you know, all of these issues could just be solved by moving to stacks, which we're going to get to. Now, I will start off with the disadvantages of stacks. Stacks obviously can be quite restrictive. If you're forced to use only a certain amount of spells, that could make things quite hard. However, technically the same problem arises with the mana bar. Eventually you'll run out of mana altogether, right? And who said this game was supposed to be easy anyway? There aren't really all that many disadvantages other than spell spamming, which is an issue, but easily the least demanding of all the magic related issues. If somebody was spamming spells in Dark Souls 1 and 2, although annoying, it was easy enough to avoid. Fuck, I mean, it's easy enough to avoid in most of the games. And like I said, if you blow your load too soon, then you're fucked, so it does have a trade-off. Being good with magic involves timing and baiting and stuff. Stacks only serve for players to be mindful of what they have left. Now, honestly, when it comes to stacks, I am kinda biased. I do admit that. I think it's a superior system, however, you're free to disagree and discuss. Or even agree, which would be nice, you know. Now, the advantages of stacks, I've hinted at already. It allows the areas of the game to be balanced around what and how many stacks of a spell is available at that point in the game. I'd say it would allow for a much more focused experience. Too many enemies, up the stacks or power of each spell, or vice versa. Stacks also mean only one thing is upgraded by any one stat. Your attunement allows for only more slots and hence more spell casts. We don't think that casting speed should be affected, but in Dark Souls 3 attunement meant more casts of spells, no, more mana as well as more slots, no, and faster cast speed. I personally dislike it when one stat controls more than one thing in like a weird nebulous way, such as casting speed or the amount of casts per attuned spell, blah 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 blah. Frankly, having more attunement shouldn't mean that your, attuned spell should just have inherently more casts. It should just be like Dark Souls 1, where if you want more casts of one spell, just fucking attune another stack of that spell. Although, one thing, I really don't think you should need to go through the game again to get another copy of that spell just to be able to attune it again. Like, it doesn't do anything. Like, that's just adding unnecessary time to something you're gonna do. Just let me attune as many of any fucking one thing that I've got at that time. Like, it doesn't matter. But anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. Now, there's so many more topics that we're going to cover with this particular series, and frankly, I really hope you enjoyed this episode. And another thing I want to point out is a massive, 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 holy shit, massive thank you to everyone that supported the channel on Patreon. Seriously, you're helping us out so much. You don't understand. I'm going to say every fucking video, because you guys are genuinely, you deserve all the praise and respect and thanks that I can genuinely give, and everybody else should be thanking you as well, because you're really keeping this channel alive. And I do want to say, I'm sorry for the slight slowdown on content recently. I've just been super busy, but should be back on track, getting more of these videos, these kind of videos out a bit more. So thank you again, guys.